We've got to start somewhere, and I am going to start with an imaginary landscape. So my imaginary landscape might include mountains, and plains, and river valleys, and then into an ocean basin. And falling down on the mountains is precipitation, rain, snow. The temperatures are changing as the seasons take place. And so these rocks that are in the mountains in here are subject to great stresses. The most important is called weathering. And what that does is to break the rock down. That means that the rivers that begin to run off on here are able to pick up those particles, and they move all the waste, all the products, downslope, across the continents and into the sea. And it goes back to new mountains, new land surfaces, and the whole cycle starts again. So we go right the way around. And all of that is taking place through time. This is the most important thing, really, is time. You can't do that without millions of years.
So one of the things I see as a geologist, when I look at a piece of rock around here, I don't actually see the rock. I actually look back 150 million years. So I'm seeing the rock as it formed, and I'm looking at Portland 150 million years ago in my head. So for example, if I look at a piece of rock like this, I see an oyster bank. This rock is just full of fossil oysters, but I actually see them alive on the seafloor, cemented to each other, just living happily away in a warm, shallow sea, layer upon layer upon layer. But this is a living reef to me, not a piece of rock. small cubic structures. And what these are the remnants of ancient salt crystals that formed in Salt Lake. At times there were salt lakes, and then at other times there was deep water in which the Portland limestones, the building limestones, were formed with ammonites and patch roofs and animals that were living in the seas. And sometimes the water was much shallower, the sea level dropped, and it left the land exposed, and then we see salt lakes with these salt crystals, and on the edge of the salt lakes there were soils, and in those soils there were forest trees. hand lens or a magnifying glass, you would see that the rock is formed of tiny, tiny little round shapes. They're called, geologically we call them ooliths. And then over time, what happened, through geological time, that really thick unit of these small ooliths, they were cemented together by mineral solutions that came through the rock. And then over time, that mineral solution has crystallized and it's cemented all of the rock components together to form these really thick, very what we call massive beds, thick beds that don't break up, that make perfect building stone. And that's why the stone is so famous, because it's such a good stone that can be carved very easily and be cut into beautiful shapes and forms really good stone to build buildings like St Paul's Cathedral in London and many grand big buildings all around the country.
They go all the way down. Yeah. That's where obviously at the bottom is where your stone's going to be sitting on to, and there'll be a beam probably going across to that direction.
Right.
to tell off the island, but first ever load back to the island.
Heritage and part of London's rich architecture. At least it's come somewhere useful. It's got a purpose now, you know. So as a Londoner, somebody who grew up with this sort of stuff, you know, doing courier work around central London, grew up in south east London, Bermondsey. It's, you know, I've drive past this probably 101 times before in my life, and not really paid any attention to it until now. You know, now it's gone. You know, it's missing. But it ain't missing because it's going back to where it came from, which is great. I love that. I love the idea of that. You know, there's no artisans anymore. You know, not like people do this. You know, I just wish I could be part of saving more of it, to be honest with you. I can't believe it in situ. It was meant to be there. This stone came out of this quarry for a reason, and it was taken all the way to London for a reason, and it stood there for so long. You know. You know,